Hi, welcome to the Pursuit of Truth. So, a bit more on Israel-Hamas war as it comes close to 3 weeks since the massacre on October 7th. And it's the same old from both sides. You know, the West and Israel and Palestine and Hamas, I guess. The same kind of arguments we're getting from journalists now that they're, playing devil's advocate, and they've moved across a little bit. At the beginning they were very pro-Israeli, and now they're coming a bit more pro-Palestine, or at least acknowledging that there's a humanitarian crisis, although a lot of people in leadership positions don't think there's a humanitarian crisis. I don't know what they call this that we're seeing. I mean, I know the pictures are, I don't know how independent the pictures are, how much Hamas is allowing journalists around. They're definitely in the hospitals and certain other areas. And of course we know the media likes to stir up, and it's always going to show suffering and things like that, because that's what they like to talk about, misery and that kind of stuff. Although, it is important for us all to see this, because this is actual fact, and it's important for us to actually see the truth, so that we can see how terrible we are as human beings, and how we haven't really changed very much from the cavemen, or so-called cavemen, that we believe that we all were. I don't know, it's just, when you take away the tags and just look at these people, it's just one set of people saying, no, there's no humanitarian crisis, and this is what happened. Let's not talk about what's happening now, let's talk about what happened that causes now. And, one side not wanting to talk about historical reasons, one side only want to talk about what's happening now, and the UN, who I think actually this time have been, the only ones to tell the truth really from the very beginning, which is surprising considering how, Iraq and Afghanistan, and how, they were used a little bit by America and the West to get their resolution so they could do their regime change and have their illegal war, which Kofi Annan, after leaving, said it was. We all know what happened in Bosnia when they were protecting the Muslims there and they left them, and then they were murdered. I suppose no organisation is perfect, but not that I'm trying to back the UN, but to sort of, now they're calling for his head because he's dared to talk about cause and effect, which we all know is part of humanity. We all know that, that things, usually have a reason. I mean, that's not justifying it. I don't understand why people can't sort of have, what happened on October the 7th, the massacre, was terrible and is a war crime. And those people who, killed innocent children, beheaded and did whatever they did, that is abhorrent and evil. And yes, I guess in the system that we live in, they deserve the ultimate punishment for that kind of mistreatment of humanity. But then also you can look at, the oppression that Palestinians have been under for the last 16 plus years, the conditions they've been living in that breeds these kinds of things. That's not sort of justifying that sort of, we know that, that's why after the Second World War, why is it the West and Britain paid to re-establish Germany? To stop, that's what we're taught in history. It doesn't excuse things that are done, but it explains, you can't. And, obviously Palestinians feel that, I guess the innocent ones, the ones that don't believe in Hamas, the ones that actually just want to live peacefully, believe that the UN and the West have left them for years, and now sending 20 million aids on an airplane to Egypt that can't even get there because they're only letting like 15 trucks in at a time, people starving to death, children. The situation that we're all watching, this is unprecedented that we're seeing this kind of action, this kind of misery and suffering. to people that have been suffering and miserable for and especially because my solution is that we just need to take away these tags, forget all these man-made constructs that we've learned, and realise that we're all human beings and we have to share the land that we can never own because we all die. And now we've got America saying to the Middle East, don't get involved, don't, whereas they're allowed to just go and strike Syria, another sovereign country. I don't get how that's not an act of war. But of course they're saying because Syria were attacking their military bases, is it, in Syria, which is their own country. But so that's not the same thing, is it? If Syria came and bombed in America, yeah, it's a different story. But America bombing Syria, a sovereign country, I mean, that's problematic, no? That's, inflating the situation when they're telling everyone else not to do that. I don't know. That's the problem we see with the world. We see with these world leaders, the hypocrisy of them. And the fact that they don't really care about us people, wherever we are, whoever we're under. All they care about is themselves and keeping the system alive. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these things, would we? Wouldn't have tanks, guns and missiles. We wouldn't need all these things. We wouldn't be fighting each other over the bits of land that we all, are meant to be looking after and helping each other. Anyway, here's these clips from Sky News.
Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden has told this programme this morning that he'll chair a meeting of the government's Emergency Cobra Committee to discuss the fate of British hostages held by Hamas and calls for a humanitarian pause to allow aid into Gaza. Israel has launched its largest raid of the war so far into the territory. Sky News understands the Israeli Defence Force conducted a targeted raid against Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip using tanks. Israel's Prime Minister said in a television statement last night that Hamas is doomed, but he would not provide details about when a full-scale ground invasion would take place for security reasons. There's diplomatic deadlock at the United Nations as the Security Council rejects competing resolutions from the US and Russia with a dispute over the language of a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire.
Really?
The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees is warning that Gaza is on the verge of running out of fuel. They say relief operations will now face significant cutbacks following Israeli airstrikes on the besieged enclave. Speaking to this programme, Oliver Dowden said they would also be discussing the wider conflict at the Cobra Committee meeting.
Well, this is a very serious situation. Actually, immediately after this media round I'm doing this morning, I'll be chairing a ministerial meeting of Cobra to update our position in relation to hostages. We are continuing to make representations across the wider Middle East. The Prime Minister had very productive conversations with the Emir of Qatar, and actually we've seen Qatar has played a pivotal role in the release of 2 hostages so far. Of course, we hope to make further progress with the release of hostages. We're engaging with our allies across the region to seek to facilitate that, but we are also engaging in terms of intelligence and other understanding of the position of them.
So a Cobra meeting, who'll be there?
Well, it will be bringing together representatives from the relevant government departments, so from the Ministry of Defence, from the Foreign Office, from the Cabinet Office. And the Cabinet Office, we have the National Security Secretariat, and I lead the Cabinet Office. This is the way of bringing different bits of government together to understand what further steps we can do and to assess the current situation.
And speaking on the programme earlier, Israel's ambassador to the UK criticised the UN Secretary-General for remarks he made about the attack by Hamas. And speaking about Israel's raid of Gaza, she said the IDF will work to protect hostages.
Last night we had Israeli troops and tanks getting into Gaza.
It was an incursion. Was that the start of the ground war?
As I'm saying, the war has a clear goal to dismantle Hamas capabilities, and we will make sure to keep our hostages safe as much as we want to make sure that we minimize civilian casualties.
Okay. The UN Secretary-General has clarified his comments. Are you content with his clarification, or do you still want him to step down?
I would say the world number one diplomat should have known better when he said what he said. So even though he clarified, I must say that he forgot what the UN stands for. The UN was established after the Second World War, after the atrocities of the Holocaust. That was the main aim of this building in New York, to make sure those atrocities won't be repeated. When you have such a clear case of evil and good, when you have such a clear case of democracy fighting against those evil terrorists, he should have known better. Saying it was created, not in a vacuum, has a blame in it, has the very sick idea that babies that were killed, people that were beheaded, they are blamed for those atrocities that Hamas committed.
Which, of course, it doesn't. That's not what he said, and that's like a false equivalence? I mean, that wasn't his intention. Anyone listening to that wouldn't read that into what he was saying. He was just, making people aware that there was an issue in Palestine before October the 7th. He wasn't saying that, that means it justifies what they did. Well, there was nothing like that. He condemned what happened. And I don't think it is as clear-cut as she says, because I'm watching it objectively, and I don't see clear-cut between good and evil, as it were. And yes, the UN was created to stop massacres happening, and unfortunately it didn't stop that one on October the 7th, but now we're seeing one that's lasted 2 weeks, and we don't know how many civilians have really been killed, but it's a few thousand at least.
Well, Security and Defence Editor Deborah Haynes is joining us now. So the ambassador not saying that it was the start of the ground war, but certainly accepting incursions are taking place.
Yes, and it was definitely the largest incursion into Gaza that we've had since this war began on the 7th of October. It came after the Prime Minister last night said that the ground invasion will happen. It's a matter of when, with the military chiefs and the ministers wanting to choose the most opportune moment. You can see Gaza behind me. About half an hour ago, there was a big plume of smoke coming up out of the buildings. We also saw a couple of flares floating down. You can hear a warplane up ahead at the moment. You can also hear drones, and just a couple of minutes ago, I could hear some distant booms. So it's clearly, of course, and it has been for nearly 3 weeks now, an active war zone. The troops that went in overnight, they used tanks. They were from the Givati Brigade, which is one of the high readiness infantry units. We actually spent time with some of their troops last week, and one of the commanders who I spoke to said that his forces were training and were ready for anything. They were actually in what looked like a sort of a mini construction of what the urban terrain inside Gaza will look like. Again, underlining just how dangerous the operation is going to be, given the traps that will be laid in there, given the fate of the hostages that are in there, and given the need given the need on the Israeli side to do all they can not to allow civilians to be killed, given the huge numbers that have already died.
Indeed. Deborah, thank you. Lord Malloch Brown, former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, President of Open Society Foundations, is with us. Hello, my Lord. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. So much to talk about. Let's talk about the situation on the ground as we speak. Incursions all the time, not yet the ground invasion that is very much anticipated. Your thoughts?
Well, it'd be interesting when this becomes the full-scale invasion that we all fear and anticipate. I think there is both the humanitarian argument that we've been hearing a lot about in the UK, the danger to civilian lives, now Palestinian civilian lives, the need to put the same price and protection on a civilian from Palestine as from Israel. But the second issue is actually, which gets less attention, is the security risk to Israel of this intervention. And having myself been at the UN when this sort of last happened, the invasion of southern Lebanon in 2006, the blood goes to the head. You want retribution, you want justice, you want to take out the military infrastructure of in that case, Hezbollah. And then you find yourself entangled as Israel in an almost impossible policing military situation where your young soldiers are targets of snipers and where you just can't disentangle the civilians from the military elements that you're trying to take out. And so this is a quagmire, and I think many friends of Israel, including a lot of very distinguished Jewish American commentators, are all cautioning Israel not to kind of in a red-hot moment go in and do something that they will deeply regret, not just on human grounds, but security grounds as well.
I wonder, my Lord, if you have a view on what we heard from the UN Secretary-General and his phraseology. He subsequently corrected himself a little bit, but the Israelis totally up in arms, demanding his resignation. I spoke to the ambassador from Israel to the United Kingdom, and she says he's the top diplomat in the world. He should choose his language better. What do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I think his whole statement was fine. I mean, it's when you take an extract from it that, you know, it can easily be taken out of context.
And he would know that, though.
Yeah, but, you know, it's hard to cram into every sentence all the caveats and cautions. But, you know, as he's insisted, and everyone asked about this, so any human decency insists, you know, this terrible crime against Israeli civilians on October the 7th that set all this off, you know, it has to be condemned again and again and again and never forgotten. But now we're dealing with a situation where after, you know, 1,000+ Israeli casualties and fatalities, we've now had probably 6,000 Palestinians killed. And so that we're getting into different issues of proportionality and risk in terms of that of Palestinian civilian lives. And he was, I think, drawing attention to that every civilian life is precious. And, you know, I do think it's also important to understand that Israel, at moments like this, gets hugely impatient with the UN and would love to be able to do this just with its ally, the United States, and you know, come back to the UN for the clear up afterwards, if you like. And so this particular incident of calling for the Secretary-General's resignation has to be put alongside the threat not to give a visa to the UN humanitarian chief, a British citizen, Martin Griffiths, who needs to go out there and supervise the aid convoys. It comes on top of the bombing of UNRWA schools where civilians have been sheltering, and the killing, although I'm sure accidental, of a number of UNRWA staff. So from the UN's point of view, they feel that they are being targeted by Israel in this period. And, you know, they're the referee. They're not a combatant on either side of this. And you don't go kick the referee.
We don't know what's going to happen next, but it will certainly lead to more of a humanitarian crisis. The British government does not want to call it a humanitarian crisis. Other people that I've spoken to do not want to use the phraseology, a humanitarian crisis. Is it?
Absolutely. You know, there's a lot of terminological debate, including your rival news channel and how it describes people. And, you know, we have to call a spade in a crisis like this. And I know language matters, which is why we were discussing the Secretary-General's statement. But, you know, this is a humanitarian crisis. And actually, I'd applaud the UK. I don't like its politics on this crisis particularly, but, you know, it has made £20 million more available in emergency aid to Gaza. And that was very much a decision of the Prime Minister and the Development Minister, Andrew Mitchell, and bravo to them. And so, you know, you don't give that money if you don't think there's a crisis.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, my Lord. I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, here's the next one. This one first. Where is it?
Bring in freshwater campaigner Fergal Sharkey now.
This was the day before.
A very good morning to you. The Palestinian Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, has announced that 704 people, including 305 children, were killed in Gaza yesterday, which would make it the deadliest day since the war began 2.5 weeks ago. As the number of deaths rise, a standoff at the United Nations over the conflict unraveled. And this morning, the Syrian state news agency said 8 Syrian soldiers have been killed in an Israeli airstrike, prompting fresh concern about the implications of the conflict for the wider region. Well, within the last half an hour, a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces told us the attack was in response to rockets fired from Syria.
We had rocket attacks launched from Syria yesterday, and therefore we retaliated and destroyed the source of those attacks against us. As I mentioned, Hezbollah has been aggravating the situation on the northern front with Lebanon, and indeed there is a concern that the northern front in itself, from Syria all the way across to Lebanon, will increase its hostilities towards Israel, as you pointed out. So, rockets fired from Syria yesterday are a threat. We have no patience for nonsense.
Well, let's just summarise the key things as they stand this morning as it relates to the Israel-Hamas war. Well, the United Nations says its aid distribution operations in Gaza will have to end this evening unless it receives more fuel for its trucks. Hezbollah TV is reporting that the leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad have met to discuss what they must do to achieve victory in Gaza. And Israel has called for the UN Secretary General to resign, accusing him of justifying Hamas's attack on Israel when he said this last night.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing.
I think that the Secretary General must resign, because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building. How can the Secretary General, with his words, justify in any way the terrible atrocities that happened to our civilians, innocent civilians?
Well, we're joined now from Jerusalem by our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle, also our international correspondent Alex Rossi's in Beirut. Let's come, Alistair, first to you in Jerusalem and how these words have gone down where you are from the UN Secretary General, of course, coming on a night where, according to those figures from the Palestinian Health Authority run by Hamas, it was the deadliest so far, highlighting the incredibly difficult balancing act at the moment.
The United Nations and Israel have a pretty fraught and tense relationship, to be honest, at the best of times, particularly over the United Nations position, official position on the occupied Palestinian territories, and the regular criticism that comes from various different corners of the United Nations at Israel's behaviour with regards in particular to Palestinians, settlement expansion, etc. I think the point that Guterres, the Secretary General, was trying to make was that there is a long, decades-old history of conflict, really, between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and many Palestinians, and it is just fact, many, if not most Palestinians, believe that they live under an oppressive occupation and they are not allowed to form a state of their own, and they are treated in a way that is completely unacceptable. Now, the Secretary General did go on later in his comments to condemn the Hamas terror attacks, and I don't think he was trying to say that the two are linked in so much that the attacks were justified, but it has created this another diplomatic row you heard there from the Israeli representatives at the United Nations, and I think that any chance that there might have been of a UN security resolution calling for a pause in bombing is now not going to happen in the short term. And so therefore the Israeli military campaign continues in Gaza. Humanitarian aid is getting into Gaza. More is going into today. but it really is very, very small fry compared to what they actually need.
Ali, stick around just if you can for a moment. Alex, wanted to get the latest from you on what has happened as it relates to Syrian forces or forces in Syria overnight, and again, how that's being viewed where you are, and the risk that this conflict broadens out.
Well, a bit of context to this. This is really an area which Israel sees as its whole northern front. The fighting has been going on in a place called the Golan Heights. Israel captured that territory from Syria in the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, it controls 2/3 of that area, and Syria controls the other third. But under international law, it's deemed as not Israeli territory, although they did annex it in 1981. Now, what we have seen since October the 7th is missiles and rockets coming from Syria, as they have from Lebanon. It's a whole area which really extends towards what Israel sees as its territory. Now, of course, the big fear is, and we haven't seen an indication that it will spread yet, it has been contained along those border areas. Rockets not really going much further than 4 or 5 kilometers at the moment. But the big fear is that there will be an accident or a miscalculation or a deliberate strategy to open up what would be a second front in this war. Now, the big player on the border where I am in this country, Lebanon, is Hezbollah. It is a paramilitary organization deemed a terror organization by most of the Western world. It has a very powerful arsenal. It has fighters that have honed their skills in the Syrian conflict and are battle hardened. And they are, of course, waiting to see where this goes. But as I was saying, at the moment, it is contained. But this is a dangerous moment. And I think what we saw with that crossfire fire just indicates how quickly this could spread, even sort of, setting the region alight into a wider regional conflagration.
And Alistair, is that the chief reason why Israel's ground invasion of Gaza has not begun yet? A fear of it triggering a wider spiraling war? Or is it more this hope that is coming from a trickle of hostage releases?
I honestly think it's a combination of things. Yes, there is pressure being put on Israel by their Western allies, who are very concerned that a ground invasion would just prove impossible for Hezbollah to remain on the sidelines. As Alex was explaining there, they are getting involved, but they're still getting involved in a limited way. If Hezbollah really wanted to enter into this war full-throated, then they have precision long-range missiles that could hit Israeli infrastructure and major Israeli cities. So we're not there yet, and we also haven't seen a major escalation in other parts of the region as well. So, of course, there is hope amongst Western allies of Israel that can remain the case, and there is hope as well that more hostages can be released. And actually, I'm just reading, some colleagues of ours are in a press conference in Doha, in Qatar, with the Turkish and the Qatari foreign ministers, and the Qataris, in a response to a question from Dominic Waghorn, our international affairs editor, about hostage negotiations, they say if we can keep discussions going between both parties, we should see some sort of breakthrough hopefully soon. So, sort of to circle back to your question, yeah, the attempt to get more hostages out and also the attempt to confine this conflict to Gaza are both reasons why the Western world are putting pressure on the Israelis to pause, or at least to sort of take a breath before they do a ground invasion. I do think there are some other factors at play as well, incidentally. I do think that there are reports coming out of the United States that perhaps the Israelis just aren't quite ready there yet. Maybe those will have an effect. And also, just simply the fact it would be incredibly complex, incredibly dangerous, and that is going to factor into the Israeli decision-making process. If they go in, they will want to go in when they really feel that it is the best window of opportunity for them to go in with the least amount of potential casualties.
Alistair and Alex, thank you both very much for that coverage, and much more from both of them throughout the day on Sky News, but in particular in our special programme on Israel and Hamas tonight with Mark Austin at 9 p.m.
There's the next one where you can hear that the media's changing. Well, they're being devil's advocate, both sides, aren't they? But definitely seem to change of
attack.
Well, last night saw Israeli troops carry out a targeted raid in northern Gaza. It was the largest ground operation inside the Gaza Strip during the war so far, but was limited in scope. Earlier I spoke with the spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Force, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner. On the bombardment of Gaza, it's causing a death toll that is surpassing anything in the decades-long Israel-Palestine conflict. What percentage of the something like 700 deaths a day that are being reported from Gaza, what percentage are Hamas terrorists?
Mark, we are not bombarding Gaza. We are targeting Hamas. We are taking out their ability to manage the Gaza Strip as a staging ground against our people. They have intentionally
in terms of airstrikes, no, with the greatest respect, in terms of airstrikes, it is the largest bombardment this century. It is in terms of the number of strikes made by an air force, it is the largest bombardment this century. So, of the 700 deaths a day, how many do you estimate to be Hamas terrorists?
In terms of terrorism, it was the largest attack ever in the history of the State of Israel that was conducted by a terrorist government with institutionalized terrorist tools and a terrorist army. We are taking the war to them, Mark. We will not sit idly by while they butcher, massacre, murder, rape, burn, behead, and then abduct Israelis. That won't happen. The expectation that this will be a sterile war is a misunderstanding of the concept of war. Indeed, we will seek out and destroy Hamas. They have no right to continue to take advantage of the civilian arena.
Okay, the reason I ask is because Save the Children, the international charity, says that this week 2,000 children have been killed in the bombardment, with more than 800 others buried in the rubble. They are clearly not Hamas terrorists, so how do you think that can be justified?
Mark, it is a true tragedy what is happening in Gaza today. However, it's not Israel's doing. Israel did not plan this war. I would even argue we failed in protecting our civilians, and Hamas came into our bedrooms and butchered our babies. But we are determined to change the paradigm. And it is indeed the civilians that are paying the price, but it is Hamas's doing.
That was Peter Lerner speaking to me earlier. Joining me now is Peter Millett, former British ambassador to Jordan. Good evening. Thank you very much for being with us, Peter. First of all, do you think the UK should be pushing or help to push for a ceasefire for humanitarian reasons, a pause in the airstrikes for humanitarian reasons?
Yes, I certainly do. And I think the position we've taken so far has not been clear. I think the best way to secure the safety of the hostages, but also to protect further killing of innocent women and children. And the numbers you've just said about the numbers of children being killed is unconscionable. And the UN has been very clear in saying that civilians must be protected and must have the essentials to survive. So I think a ceasefire is the best way to give diplomacy time to work, not only to secure further releases of hostages. So far, the work behind the scenes, the back channels between the Americans, the Qataris, no doubt the Egyptians and others were working behind the scenes to secure the release of hostages. I do not believe that bombarding civilians with airstrikes is the best way to secure either the release of the hostages or a long-term peace and stability for Israel.
Do you think it is possible to do what the Israelis say they want to do, which is to wipe out Hamas?
I don't think that airstrikes and even bunker bombs and things like that is going to wipe out Hamas, because I think the killing of civilians, any young man who sees his mother, sister, daughter killed like that is going to be a very angry man. So in a way, it doesn't justify the terrorism, but it is a reason for more people to become extremist. And I also, what I'm really worried about is the much wider implications in the region. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Jordan. You see the large demonstrations in Jordan. I think tomorrow, after Friday prayers across the Arab world, across the Muslim world, you're going to see much more public outrage. And if airstrikes or if the continuing bombardment is going to lead to miscalculations, there's a big risk of drawing in Hezbollah, the Iranians, the Houthis and others, of a much wider conflagration. And again, that is not in the interests of the security of Israel, let alone the security of the wider Middle East or of the world.
Do you think such an escalation is likely?
I think the politics of Israel means that Mr. Netanyahu has to be seen to be getting revenge. And I know that there's a lot of pressure within Israel for wiping out Hamas. That's fine, but Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, does not represent the innocent civilians, the women, the children who are being killed in Gaza. So I think a ceasefire not only provides a framework for releasing the hostages, for bringing in the massive humanitarian assistance which is needed in Gaza, but also to look at the much longer term future of getting justice for the Palestinian people.
When this war ends, do you think that Israel knows what it wants to do with Gaza? Do you see any kind of end game for Gaza?
I think there's a real question as to who will be able to supervise or govern Gaza. It can't be Hamas. I don't think the Palestinian Authority has the ability, or even that the people in Gaza want the Palestinian Authority. I think it needs some sort of international umbrella to help the rebuilding of Gaza. And then there needs to be a process. President Biden has been talking again about a two-state solution. A two-state solution has been a mantra for diplomats for many, many years. The only alternative is a one-state solution, which is never going to work. But some sort of process needs to be got underway to bring a homeland for the Palestinian people, which is what they deserve.
And just finally, there's a question over whether Benjamin Netanyahu survives in the long term. If he does survive, can you ever see a Netanyahu government getting involved in peace negotiations, meaningful negotiations with the Palestinians?
Well, I think the last time he was involved in negotiations was when I was in Jordan and in Amman, and they quickly fizzled out and nothing has happened since. I think Mr. Netanyahu has done his best to undermine the Oslo Accords and to ensure that there isn't a two-state solution. But something along those lines is the only way to bring peace to the region, but also to bring the peace and security that the Israeli people themselves deserve.
Okay, Peter Millett, I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, a former Israeli Special Forces soldier who took part in the invasion of Gaza in 2014 has told us he fears Hamas can never be wiped out. Benzi Sanders, now an activist opposing the occupation of the Palestinian territories, says that the war may only strengthen support for Hamas's ideology by radicalizing many more young men. Earlier, I asked him about his time as a soldier fighting in Gaza.
My Special Forces infantry unit went to the border. The entire night sky was lit up with explosions, deafening explosions, as the Air Force and the artillery bombarded the village. We were going into a small village with the purpose of identifying and demolishing a tunnel that was going into Israel. We were only a few kilometers in. We weren't very deep in. We were trying to secure an area for these engineers to demolish the tunnels. We pulled out. Right after we pulled out, the Air Force came and demolished, obliterated almost the entire neighborhood that we were in.
So you had your experience, Benzi, in 2014. This is going to be altogether of a different magnitude, more civilian deaths, more threats to Israeli soldiers.
I mean, it's already multiple orders of magnitude worse. I mean, something like 3 times as many Palestinians have already been killed through these bombing campaigns as there were killed in the entire 2014 war, and we haven't even began the ground invasion. Hamas is stronger. That's just a fact. Hamas is stronger, even though we fought them, and I believed during that fighting and with our sacrifice and all the destruction that we wrought in Gaza that we had dealt them a decisive blow. But that was just not true.
Is it possible, do you think, to wipe out Hamas? The Israeli government has said after this appalling terror attack, we will wipe out Hamas. Is that possible?
I think the only way, I think this government is incapable of doing it unless there is a dramatic, axiomatic shift in our approach towards Palestinians. We approach towards Palestinians, they can just be controlled. We can just keep them indefinitely under military occupation, deny them rights, deny them freedoms, the same ones that we cherish for ourselves, they don't have. And it's not about security, it's about ideology. We're ideologically committed to controlling the entire land of Israel exclusively for the Jewish people. And
but there will be many Israelis who simply want revenge on Hamas for this hideous attack.
That will only strengthen them, even if we dismantle and are able to defeat the physical terrorist organization Hamas. We will be strengthening the idea of violent resistance, because the only way to defeat the idea of violent resistance is to create an alternative and to work towards an alternative, one that our government is fundamentally opposed to. So this government can't defeat Hamas.
So you think it will, in effect, radicalize another generation of young Palestinians?
Of course. We're just killing them, and we don't provide any alternative. We're keeping them under a debilitating siege. They're running out of fuel. They're running out of drinking water. What do you think that, Hamas is a terrorist organization. They've already proven that they can murder babies, and we're saying it's on them to save the lives of the Palestinian infants in the NICU in the hospital. It's up to them. You think they care? They just murdered babies, and we're denying that we're creating this horrific human conditions. What do you think the people in Gaza are going to think about us after what we're doing now? We have to create an alternative. We want to defeat Hamas. We have to turn the Palestinian public against them.
But how do you do that? In the light of the terror attack, how do you do that? What is the process? Where is the process that doesn't include Hamas? Where is the process?
Well, we have to stop forcibly expelling Palestinians from their homes in villages throughout the West Bank. We have to crack down on settler violence, and we have to say out loud that we're committed towards a peaceful, negotiated solution with Palestinians in which they achieve freedom, achieve independence, and achieve the independence and rights that we cherish so dearly for ourselves.
What are your fears for the next few days and weeks?
I fear for Palestinian civilians who are being relentlessly bombed. I fear for citizens of Israel who are vulnerable to escalations on multiple fronts because of this war. I feel for many friends and loved ones are.
Your brothers going in?
I hope not. But obviously, the tragedy is that no matter what we do, we won't be able to defeat the idea of that Hamas represents, the ideology that it represents of armed resistance, unless we try to create an alternative. And I really believe that this government is incapable of doing that.
Benzi, thank you very much indeed.
Sure thing.
It's funny, it's actually like two sets of people arguing over who to control them in real terms, isn't it? I mean, I know like the freedoms and all that stuff is the important things, that everyone gets freedom and a great existence in their one existence, but actually what they're really fighting over is they don't want to share the land. They can't share it because Israel and Palestine both want to own that same bit of land. So they're fighting over who gets to control the people. And the people are participating in that, knowing that at the end of the day, whoever wins, they're going to be controlled by one set of people or two sets of people. And probably they're not going to, because of the system the way it is, even if you live in the best country in the world, you're still slave to that system. Here's the next one.
Hello, good morning. You're watching the Early Rundown. Leading the news today, the US military has launched airstrikes on 2 locations in eastern Syria in the early hours of this morning. Now, this follows a series of drone and missile attacks on US bases and troops in Syria and Iraq, which began last week. In a statement, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that the US will not tolerate such attacks and will defend itself and its interests. EU leaders have also called for rapid and unhindered humanitarian access to Gaza to provide life-saving aid to civilians embroiled in the conflict. And this comes after recent division among member states about striking a balance between condemning Hamas and supporting Israel's right to defend itself. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza has revealed a 212-page document allegedly containing the identities of more than 7,000 Palestinians killed so far. It's understood, though, that US President Joe Biden and Israeli military have questioned the validity of these figures. And UK border force teams have been sent to Egypt to quickly provide British nationals stuck in Gaza with an escape route. Well, the Prime Minister says the Foreign Office is in contact with around 200 UK nationals on the Strip. Well, let's go live now to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's in southern Israel. And Deborah, let's just focus on the developments this morning. The US military is launching retaliatory airstrikes in eastern Syria in the early hours of this morning, prompting some strong words there from US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin.
Yes, it's a really key development. There were two F-16 fighter jets involved in this attack, and according to the Pentagon, they targeted weapons stores used by these Iranian-backed militias. These specific targets were linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is known to fund, support, train militias that are based in Syria and also in Iraq. Now, the US has small bases of troops in both those countries. It's a hangover, really, from the fight against Islamic State. And of course, they're under threat from Islamic State-style militants, but as well from these Iranian-backed forces. And what the Pentagon has said is that since tensions in the region began to escalate in the wake of the October the 7th attack here in Israel that prompted Israel's war with Hamas, and then the response from groups that are sympathetic and aligned with Hamas, which also receives support from Iran, then began upping attacks against US forces in the region. And specifically since October the 17th, the Pentagon says there have been 19 such attacks against US forces in Iraq and in Syria. They're trying very hard to draw a clear distinction between events happening here and the US military action taken this morning, which they say was limited, targeted, specifically sent to send a message to those Iranian-backed militias to stop targeting US forces, to underline the impact so far of those attacks on those US personnel. They said that 21 US military personnel had received minor injuries but were back at work, and one US civilian contractor had died from a cardiac issue while he or she was taking shelter. So it's clearly very serious. They're clearly very worried. There's a huge concern about the potential for further escalation in the region should this war widen. But for now, they're hoping that this targeted strike will send a sufficient message for these sorts of attacks to stop.
Deborah, thank you. That's Deborah Haynes, our security and defence editor, with the latest from Ashkelon in southern Israel. Qatar's senior negotiator has told Sky News that he believes all civilian hostages can be released in the coming days, but only if there's a pause in the fighting. The Minister of State, Mohammed Al-Khalifa, has been speaking exclusively to Sky's international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn.
It is a world away from Gaza, Qatar's skyline troubled only by a rare autumn storm. But they are playing an outsized role here in the conflict by mediating the fate of its hostages.
It's a very, very difficult negotiation that we've been dealing with. And with this violence increases every day, with the bombing continuous every day, our task has become even more difficult.
Qatar was instrumental in the release of the only 4 hostages to be freed so far, an American mother and daughter and 2 elderly Israeli women. There are thought to be more than 200 left behind from 25 different countries.
Trying to deliver those messages.
Giving his only interview since the war began, Qatari negotiator Dr. Mohammed Al-Khulaifi says there is now the opportunity to release many more.
Our target is to release all of the civilian hostages. That's what we're working on, and that's what we want to achieve. We're getting there. Every day we become more hopeful of the possibility of filling that gap and bringing the parties together. We remain hopeful. We do the best as we can, trying to get everyone's soon, and hopefully we can achieve that goal within the upcoming days.
Can you talk about the mechanics of the release of hostages and how much the bombing gets in the way of that? I mean, what is the problem there? Is it actually getting out to the hostages and getting them to safety?
I think it's mainly the difficulties for us to talk to the two sides. When an escalation happens and the killing of people over there, it's getting more difficult for us to talk logically to the people sitting there on the negotiating table.
There's a catch. For more hostages to come out, the violence must pause from both sides. Is it fair to say if Israel goes in on the ground, it's going to make your job a lot harder?
Any escalation whatsoever is going to make our job really harder. Any escalation whatsoever. So we're trying to send those messages to our partners and friends. It's very important that everyone participate in this. Everyone should ask and seek a level where we could achieve even more out of this conflict.
There must be a reprieve in the fighting to let in more aid, they say. If not, Gaza's humanitarian situation could become catastrophic.
I think it's going to be disaster. It's the situation over there is really horrible. The lack of water, food, medicine, fuel to generate the energy over there. It is not going to help sustaining the situation.
They are bracing themselves here and across the region for escalating conflict, but hoping for some kind of lull to let diplomacy still have a chance of working. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Doha, Qatar.
Oh no, it's just the worrying thing about how Iran, attacking US bases in Syria, and how America is just going into a sovereign country and dropping bombs, is this mindset issue of how they see each other, even though they're both human beings. But this is, like I say, this is the problem of the system that we live in, and that's why I want to get rid of this idea of division of human beings. We should see each other as human beings, not as different country people, because that just divides us. And anything that divides us can't be positive or beneficial to humanity. As we can see, this is what happens when you do that. And also, I don't know, it's just... There was something I was going to say, but it's just gone out of my head now. To do with this bombing. Oh yeah, if these Iranian bases are in Europe, would America just be going over and bombing them? I don't think so. And that's my worry about this mindset of seeing the Middle East as somewhere you can just go and bomb and it doesn't really matter. That is troubling. And also, when you're telling the rest of the region, don't get involved, don't. Bit hypocritical. And then the problem is by creating that kind of hypocrisy, well then that means that no one's going to listen to you, but it's easy then for America to turn around if Iran do something, or Hezbollah or Lebanon do something, and say, look what you've done, without anyone saying, well, you were first.
Very much indeed. We're actually going to go live to Jerusalem now, because there is a briefing being held by the UN, so let's just listen in.
UNRWA has drastically limited its consumption of fuel, but this came at a cost. Our team had to make tough decisions that no humanitarian workers should do. What needs more support? Bakeries, water station, life support machine in the hospital. All this needs fuel to function. The siege means that food, water and fuel, all basic commodities, are being used to collectively punish more than 2 million people, among them a majority of children and women. There have been intense negotiation and endless shuttle diplomacy to open a humanitarian supply line. So far, it has only resulted in a handful of aid convoys. This will not reverse the fact that Gaza is being strangled. The people of Gaza feel shunned, alienated, and abandoned. Over the last week, I followed very closely the focus about the number of trucks entering in Gaza. Many of us saw in these trucks a glimmer of hope. This is, however, becoming a distraction. These few trucks are nothing more than a crumbs that will not make a difference for the 2 million people in the streets. We should avoid conveying the message that few trucks a day means the siege is lifted for humanitarian aid. This is not true. The current system in place is geared to fail. What is needed is meaningful and uninterrupted aid flow. And to succeed, we need a humanitarian ceasefire to ensure this aid reaches those in need. This should not...
So a news conference there being
they
held
faded out,
in...
probably because of what he's saying, but it's true what he's saying, and it's interesting that the UN are coming quite hard down now, but I think the problem is like, this is all in plain sight. There's 3 weeks now, we've all heard these things, we all know what's going on, how the innocent Palestinian people as well as Hamas are being treated. Yeah, for Hamas that's fine, but for the innocent people it's not fine to be, in the UN's word, strangling them by this siege. But we're all watching, and all the world leaders that we've elected in to do this job, and we can't stop these things, we elect them so that they can, but they don't have the moral compass, but we're all watching it in plain sight. And then at the end we're going to say, oh, well, there was nothing done, but we're all watching. It's the same as where we watch all the humanitarian suffering that goes on because of our system, the starvation, the poverty and all that stuff.
The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, when she spoke to you a little bit earlier, said that she believed the main block on that was that there wasn't a pause in fighting long enough to facilitate people coming out. This is what she told you.
And we're calling for the safe passage for British national passport holders to get out. So we're still in the same position, but Border Force going there is so that we can be prepared if we can get them out. Obviously, it's a very fluid situation on the ground. There's a lot of intense diplomacy going on, and that's obviously the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary are leading that. But we just want to make sure we've got everything in place. We've got aid there at the border as well. We've sent a plane with lots of aid there as well, just so that we're ready to, if that pause is realised, which we've been calling for, that we're ready to optimise that as much as possible.
Now, government officials say this morning that they don't want anyone in the Gaza Strip, British nationals, to go to the Rafah crossing now, that there's no, at the moment, there's no announcement to be made about that crossing accepting people making that trip into Egypt, and they don't want people to potentially put themselves in more dangerous positions. The government isn't calling for a ceasefire, and behind the scenes what they stress is that the difference is basically a ceasefire could potentially allow Hamas to regroup and is, in their view, denying Israel the right to defend itself after the attacks of almost 3 weeks ago now. But what the Prime Minister has called for is these targeted specific pauses, and they say those could be time limited, they could take place in certain areas in Gaza to allow aid to come in or to allow people to come out. That's also being echoed by Labour this morning. They've adopted that position as well, even if some MPs do want a full-out ceasefire. But of course, in the last few days, we're seeing increasing activity, Israeli forces moving into Gaza, preparatory work going on for that ground invasion. So I think whether actually those messages that are coming from multiple countries and multiple parties now is getting through is still uncertain.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Now, heavily armed.
There you go. It's like, it's face value, really, isn't it? That's what it is like. We're going to send a plane with £20 million of thing, but it's going to sit in the back of the queue because there's hundreds of trucks waiting to go through, and they're only letting like 20 in at a day. But it looks like you're doing something. I mean, you are doing something, but it's actually not going to benefit because it's going to take ages before it even gets to those people, and it's drip fed so small that a lot of people are going to die before they ever get that aid. But it looks like you're doing something. You can say, yes, we did help. But did you? This is the world that we live in of face value. We're all watching the suffering going on. This is what the people we've elected are doing. You can't tell me they couldn't get... they put these resolutions through. They all say, yeah, we want a ceasefire. Oh, no, they don't want a ceasefire. We want to pause, as if there's any difference. We're going to argue about semantics while people are suffering and dying. And then they put it on the table, on the UN, and it only takes one country to say no, and then it's gone. What a silly system that is. We believe in democracy, so it should be vote, as long as the majority vote, that should be enough to carry it, as long as it's not, going into war. But so they table these motions and then they don't vote for them. Because you don't see that. Then you get Gillian Keegan talking about, we want ceasefire, we all want ceasefire. But then, they don't say that. They want a pause, a targeted pause, not a ceasefire. And then when they get to a chance to vote against it. Face value. Making you feel like they're actually caring about the suffering, but they're not really caring about suffering, because if they cared about suffering, they wouldn't live in the system that we live in that helps poverty, helps people suffer around the world and in their own countries that they lead. The system that breeds our people and our leaders and us, shapes us, is not for the caring and benefit of humanity. It's for the control. It's for us to keep working, keep doing all these things, wasting our energy, wasting the free things that we found ourselves on this place. Anyway, there you can see, I think these podcasts just show you that how messy war is and why war is not the answer, and how diplomats and world leaders use semantics, use their words, spell casting, propaganda, making you feel like, yeah, we care about humanity. And everyone with the same mantras repeating. But the real fact is, people are dying, either side. Human beings are killing human beings, either side. It doesn't matter. There's no justification for killing of human beings. Is there? Is that the world we want to live in? But that's the world we're all endorsing and carrying on. Take care, take it easy, God bless, and peace.